Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So housing has got to be the number one issue. Housing affordability in Canada today, and frankly, in other places around the world as well. And so I've read some interesting articles and posts by a gentleman by the name of Pascal, who is the Senior Director, Transportation, Infrastructure and Construction at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. So he's agreed to join us tonight and tell us a little bit about what's going on. Pascal leads the Canadian Chamber's Housing and Development Strategy Council, which convenes a diverse array of industry stakeholders to engage with key federal decision makers and address our country's housing crisis. Over the course of our discussion, I think we're going to talk about the scope of the problem in Canada, why business is concerned about housing, and what policy changes can help to restore affordability. Welcome to the show. Pascal, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Brian.
My pleasure. So tell me a little bit about yourself and the Chamber, if you could, to start with, and why you're interested in this topic.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I'm with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. So for anyone who's not familiar, we're Canada's largest and most activated business network. We represent 400 chambers of commerce and boards of trade across the country, as well as 200,000 businesses of all sizes from all sectors of the economy. And how that ties into what we're going to be discussing today, our focus is on creating the conditions for collective success, and we're leveraging those deep connections, what we hear from that network, including the challenges that they contend with on a regular basis, to create sort of a national perspective that allows us to work with government on those economy-friendly policies and provide services that inform commerce and enable trade. So as you mentioned, transportation, infrastructure, and construction are my areas of focus, and obviously housing falls within that, but imported related elements such as supply chains and the importance of being able to reliably transport goods into, out, and across the country also matter very much. And so, yeah, that's kind of why we were interested in this, and I can get a little bit more into why we're talking about this today.
Well, I'd like to. So I would have thought the Chamber of Commerce is all about business, and
Yes.
and what you're trying to do is assist businesses in growing profitably, and their interactions with government. Housing affordability seems like just a personal issue for tons of people across the country, but it's doesn't make logical sense to me that it would be a concern of actually it does, but I'm just going to ask rhetorically, why is it of interest to the Chamber of Commerce?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I mean, we haven't historically been involved or vocal about this issue, but we recently established, as you mentioned, the Housing and Development Strategy Council, because housing is consequential to business and the Canadian economy. And while members of our council itself are leaders in creating housing supply in Canada, housing is a business concern for more than just those that are directly in the housing space. And we hear it from a lot of our members, actually, what's going on with housing. So at the Canadian Chamber, we spent a lot of time talking about competitiveness. And if you're a business operating in Canada, you need to be able to hire top talent. So Canada can't attract and retain that talent if those that we're trying to attract don't believe that they're going to be able to afford a place to live. So we could end up with some companies operating at a disadvantage because they can't get that top talent, but then also multinationals thinking about whether having a significant operation here in Canada is really a good idea. And so Canada's global competitiveness and economic prosperity, it's intricately linked with our ability to attract that investment. And that's why we feel we need to see more done on housing. I mentioned it in the piece for the Globe and Mail from a few weeks ago, but it does bear repeating. Former Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation CEO Crombie said in no uncertain terms that we can't succeed economically in the 21st century without Canadians having access to the housing that they need. And so that's really a big piece for us. And I have there's an analysis from our Canadian Chamber's business data lab that also noted a correlation between business optimism and housing affordability that ties into it too.
It's really become one of the most important issues just in the last, maybe year. Why do you think it's become such, why has it been elevated in the public consciousness to such a degree just in the last little while?
Well, I think public consciousness is pretty straightforward. I think Canadians are just feeling the pinch, obviously, and then it becomes part of that discourse and a major issue. I mean, the housing crisis itself, it's a multifaceted problem, and I feel like every week we're reading about a new culprit, and accompanying that is as well a simple solution on how to fix it. But the fact is there really is no silver bullet. It's going to require a whole suite of changes across multiple levels of government. And so I think one area of general consensus is that we need to increase the housing supply. I think you've talked about it pretty much at length on your show as well. But you had the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation's deputy chief economist on. He's been pretty clear. The government policy is incredibly important, so are their investments, but so is increased participation from the private sector, and that's kind of where the Canadian Chamber comes into the conversation. So the challenge is really just so significant that the private sector has to be involved. Governments can't really do this alone, and so there's going to be the need for a little bit more participation on that front.
Pascal, how did we get into this problem?
Yeah, this is a long-standing problem, and I think right now we're talking a lot about constraints put on the system by demand. But I mean, the fact is, over the years, we have not been terribly good at building housing. We've had periods in the past where we have been a little bit better about establishing that. But what we're hearing, especially from our members who are in that creation housing space, developers, those who invest in housing as well, they're facing a number of obstacles right now. I would say the biggest one, and I think, again, when we talk about supply, everybody sort of agrees this is the major constraint, is a lot of the municipal regulations that are limiting the ability to create that housing, be it zoning, be it approval timing. That's something that we hear from our members all across the country, and it's very much, it's regional, of course, but it's also a national problem because everybody's running into the same thing. The other piece as well, I think, that we're facing, especially right now, is shortage of labor and construction materials. Sorry, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I want to go through these piece by piece if I could. I apologize. So we'll come back to shortage of labor and construction materials in a minute if we could. So let's come back to municipal regulation. So I understand that we are building about the same number of housing starts today as we did in the 1970s, and our population has doubled. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's something around those lines. I don't want to speak to those figures exactly, but yes, we're definitely operating at a housing deficit, and what we're projected to need by 2030, I believe, is the number that was frequently cited by CMHC. We are definitely shorter, and I believe even for 2023, housing starts and completions were lower than expected.
So how does municipal regulation restrict that?
I think that what you run into a lot is specific issues around zoning. And I think NIMBYism plays a huge part in that. Obviously, if you own a property, you might not want to see, a multi-unit property be erected next to you. And I think that also when you have local city councilors that are, working to get reelected, the voices that are most prominent, you don't want to start saying, okay, well, we're going to swap out zoning regulations and upset all the voters that are currently, that you're going to count on to bring you back to office in the next period. So it's a bit of a problem on that front. And I think that we're starting to see that impacted a little bit. And this is something that we had called for as well when Minister Fraser was moved into the housing portfolio, is that, first they look at the funding for infrastructure projects so that they could require that some of those funds be tied to the creation of more housing. And what we've seen with the Housing Accelerator Fund, which is the other piece we had talked about, was that they're going directly to municipalities and saying, okay, well, we're going to provide you funding to create more housing, but you need to start addressing some of these problems. And I think his tagline was legalize housing is what he's been saying. But again, kind of going at the core and acknowledging that these are the problems and we have to attack them directly because they're very specific and they're very regional. That's why some of those agreements you've been seeing, I think there have been 30 some of them to this point since he started doing them in the fall, have had specific measures that are specific to those regions and those rules.
And it was interesting in that regard that in Windsor, just last week, I think the government took back the Housing Accelerator Fund because they didn't think that the Windsor City Council was doing enough in regards to housing. Is that correct?
Yeah, there was something like that. And there was also something in Metro Vancouver, I believe, where they had a deal early on and they pulled the funding immediately after because the municipality had moved forward to approve many new development charges. And just the fact was they were looking to kind of make sure that that didn't happen. And they were trying to ease the burden on those who were actually building the housing, who are under a lot of strain right now and contending with some of the issues that I mentioned a little bit earlier that we'll get into. But yeah, that's exactly it. And this is something that they're trying to address. And frequently when there is a proposal, you have seen those letters that have been made very public. The mayor of Calgary published hers as well too, but the letter from Minister Fraser saying, we understand your application, we would like to give you money, but you need to work on these other things and you need to change these things before we can approve these funds for you to build more housing.
So I don't want to paraphrase you, but I'm going to. And so I think what you just said a couple minutes ago is that city councilors and city councils gave into NIMBYism and restricted because they wanted to get reelected. And so they restricted housing being built. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's essentially the sense of that exactly. It's more, they're reliant on their voters that are currently in their constituency to bring them back to office, and therefore, why would you go and upset those in the interest of creating more density? It becomes a losing proposition for them, and so in that system, there's not really an easy way out of it.
But if this has led to the worst housing crisis in Canadian history and the worst affordability crisis in Canadian history, why would they do that? Why would they do what's good for them getting reelected, but not what actually is good for their cities or for society or for Canada? Doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I know.
Elect politicians to actually think things through and make the right decisions, even if it's going to cost them a few votes.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking, I think, about a macro issue and then micro management of it, right? So, from our perspective, if you're looking at it nationally, provincially, even from the level of, the greater metropolitan area, you've got, well, we need to do something about this. And I think that's what we're seeing with the pressure for the Housing Accelerator Fund dealing directly with mayors that'll have more say over. But again, at a regional city councilor level, where I think city council level, where a lot of these decisions are made, yeah, you're seeing some policies that aren't necessarily going to be beneficial to increasing density, especially, which I think in those major areas is what's needed. And I think most would agree that that's the easiest and best way to increase housing supply, especially around transit areas and where you're going to need those things.
Pascal, you're saying it far more nicely than I, but I think this has been a failure of leadership, that city councilors, mayors, and city councils collectively have made decisions such that they get reelected so they keep their jobs when only 20 to 40% of the population will come out and vote, instead of doing what's the right thing. And they've created a housing affordability crisis that has robbed the next generation of the opportunity to live the Canadian dream of buying a house. Isn't that true?
Yeah, that's basically, that's the root of NIMBYism, really. That's exactly it. So yeah.
So it's shameful. It's just shameful. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Pascal Chan from the Chamber of Commerce, Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the expert on transportation infrastructure and housing, in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with Pascal Chan, who is the really smart guy in the room. He is the Senior Director of Transportation, Infrastructure, and Construction at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. He's also head of their housing strategy work right now. This man has a really interesting and varied and broad background. I got to tell you, he's got an economics degree to start with. Then he was a consultant in medical device establishment licensing, then a consultant in program operations branch, acquisition branch, corporate management branch, intergovernmental affairs for the Privy Council Office, information services, a consultant in government relations at a company by the name of Proof. Then he worked with the Canadian Real Estate Association, both in policy and government relations. Then energy pipelines, director of federal and stakeholder relations, and then innovative medicines as the director of government affairs. You've been in medicines, in energy, in communications, in the Privy Council office, in public safety, in infrastructure, and in health. You've been all over the map.
Yeah, no, it's been a varied experience to this point, but always interesting work and always different files keeps things interesting.
But with all those interesting files, and I think we could probably, with your background in health, we could have a long conversation about health policy. With your background in energy pipeline, we could have a long conversation about getting pipelines approved. But I don't think there's any issue bigger than housing affordability. And, you take a look at the polls, people are worried about affordability. And it's not just housing, but it's inflation and groceries and other stuff as well. But I think you sent me a slide in regards to the places where people pay more than 30% of their income on housing. And it's dramatic. What's going on?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a correlation that we noted. Our business data lab works with Statistics Canada and does analysis of a survey that they conduct. It's a survey on business confidence and the outlook on there. And so one of the things they noted when they started asking about housing, especially, or they started correlating, the price of housing across markets and places where Canadians were spending more than 30% of their income on housing. That business optimism, as far as it is over the last few quarters, is really kind of lowest in the places where housing is the least affordable. And that's just a very interesting outlook. And then you see that optimism goes a lot higher where housing is more affordable. So something very interesting to note. And again, as we talked a little bit earlier, for the reasons the Canadian Chamber is starting to talk about housing, because our businesses are concerned about it, but also obviously businesses in places where housing is not affordable are not feeling very optimistic about the prospects going forward.
Tell me, if you could, how it impacts people's lives. For some people, they live in a nice big house and the price goes up. They kind of like that because it adds to their net worth, right? So how does the lack of housing affordability actually impact people? And who does it impact?
Yeah, I think it impacts everybody because, again, especially I would speak to my personal experience a little bit too, and I think there's probably some value in doing that. But again, myself, I think I'm one of the older millennials, and we talked about what it would take for me to kind of get into property ownership, and this was over 10 years ago. But one of the things that I was looking at, I was fortunate to be able to stay home a little bit longer, save up a little bit of money, and get into there. And then once I kind of had purchased a piece of property somewhere that I could live in, things got a little bit easier for me. I was never sort of concerned about doing that down the road, and that's something that we focused a lot on when I was during my time at the Canadian Real Estate Association. How can kind of younger millennials get into their first property and things like that? It's obviously something that, as we mentioned, you should be spending. They were thinking that you spend about, the general rule is less than, I think, 30% of your income on your housing, and so that's probably the biggest expense for most people, or it should be. So that's something that obviously affects everyone, and then people who are in situations where that is a little bit more precarious, or they don't have a set or steady way to know that they have housing, obviously it becomes a big stress and a big concern for them.
Who specifically, like if you could think about groups, are the people that are most impacted by the lack of housing affordability? Is it older people or younger people?
I think that if you look at rates of people who are housed and not housed, I think, or people who own versus don't own, first of all, I would say the people that are most impacted are those who are unhoused. I think obviously that's very clear that they're going to be feeling the greatest effects of housing policy and the market, and being able to be housed or not is just it's critical, and it's something that really needs a lot of work in this country. But then I think as you kind of progress further, those that are struggling to pay rent, again, that becomes a large piece, and they're probably, again, most impacted as well. I think you saw it during the pandemic as well. There were a lot of people that were very concerned about being able to pay rent. And then further, those that are paying rent but looking to buy something, to own a piece of property, obviously that's probably the next step up. And then those who do own and right now have been contending with rate increases, who suddenly can't afford their mortgage, I think those are the ones who, again, are very concerned. So really, housing is an entire spectrum, and I think there's concern right across it. And like you said, perhaps some that have owned for some time, very comfortable or done paying off their mortgage, or perhaps less concerned about it. But I think that, that's kind of where I would say the assessment is.
So I guess what I'm pushing you to say, and you haven't said it exactly, but I think this is really a travesty, because the people that are impacted the most are young people that want to get into the housing market. Old people like me, we've already got our house, but it's my kids that are really robbed of the opportunity to live the Canadian dream of buying a home, and they end up having to either buy a small condo of 700 square feet or less in urban areas, or probably not even buy, just rent, and stuck in rent for the rest of their lives, never being able to build up that home ownership.
Yeah,
Number two, it is
previously. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Number two, it's newcomers that are coming into this country that want to share in the Canadian dream, and that's why they came here, and they can't get into home ownership. And it is renters, people that have been renting for a while that want to get into home ownership. And so it really is, when you think about our social system where we try to help people, we are hurting the most vulnerable.
Yeah, I think that you had talked about on a previous show that, I think your father told you that you should be able to afford a home that's 3 times your income. And I think that what I hear from my dad these days too is if, he and my mother had tried to do it today with today's market and the salaries they were making, even adjusted for inflation, they wouldn't have been able to be homeowners that young in their 20s, and it would have been very complicated. So yeah, this is the affordability crisis that we're dealing with. And unfortunately, like you said, I think obviously people that are looking to get into home ownership or even struggling with rent are really, really feeling the pinch right now.
And let's talk about this other issue that you mentioned about people that have built up their net worth, because I think this is something that people don't understand. Um, Maybe I don't understand it, but I don't think people understand. If house prices are high, and you feel like you've got this big net worth, but then if you sell your house, you got to buy a similarly overpriced house, and so therefore this big net worth that you thought you had built up really is paper net worth, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then the opposite to that, or the reciprocal to that, is if housing prices went down and you lost, $500,000 of your net worth, but you moved into another house that was $500,000 cheaper because all houses go down, have you really lost anything? It's like paper net worth and paper lack of net worth, because housing, you don't get that net worth until you actually sell it and move somewhere else, or frankly, die.
Yeah, I think that you're right. Obviously, you don't actually touch any of that money until you sell the property. So it's your net worth on paper, and it's dictated at the point when you're going to be exiting the market. Yeah, and I think that a lot of Canadians, especially, have put most of their, not a lot of that. I don't want to cite a statistic specifically, but I will say that there are Canadians that have, counting on the sale of their home eventually, to be the largest part of their retirement plan as they downsize. But again, the housing prices in the market are generally kind of applicable across the board in the city that you want to stay in, especially if you want to stay in the community. So you're kind of banking on the exact downsize in the area that you want being an affordable option, and you don't necessarily know that that's going to be possible, which is again why we need to address this issue across the board and kind of tackle that supply piece.
Okay, so supply. So number one issue is trying to improve the NIMBYism, or at least get city councils that don't pay as much attention to the NIMBYism and still approve. And you've mentioned that both the provincial and federal governments are trying to use some levers to incentivize, or frankly, use a stick of lack of infrastructure money to force municipalities to do the right thing rather than just give in to the local NIMBYs that don't want them to do the right thing. Is that working?
I think it's working to an extent, but I mean the ability. Well, it is definitely working when you see the agreements and you see that they have changed some of these zoning and municipal rules around various items. So obviously, when we're striking these deals, it is working. But if you look at the total amount of units that are being created, are those going to be sufficient to erase the deficit of housing that we're in? No, it's going to take a lot more than that.
So you mentioned transit areas. I keep hearing about rules to change what you can build around major transit areas. And in British Columbia, I understand what recently happened is the provincial government in BC changed the rules for major transit areas. And actually, interesting enough, their major transit area, unlike Ontario, wasn't just subway stations and GO train stations. They actually extended it to bus exchanges, where different bus routes have transfer points. And there they made it that the minimum you can build, or you can get approval for, I guess, is 20 stories. So that rather than what we hear in Ontario all the time about, city councils putting maximums on, here they're saying you can get at least 20 stories. They're really trying to incentivize the building. Is that a smart move?
Yeah, that's a smart move, definitely. I think especially around transit, you need to increase that density. Obviously, developers are focused on being able to work around those areas too, because that's where you're going to be able to have the most people and a concentration to have access to transportation. I think I've heard on a previous conversation as well, some of the rules around parking kind of comes up a lot too, but solving those issues by having more density around transit stations is definitely a good option. Look, I think at this point right now, anything that's going to result in us creating more supply and density in places, especially where markets are not very affordable. I think you were just talking about Vancouver, but Toronto as well, a lot of the major cities. These are solutions that are going to create more supply, increase density, and I think that that's the direction we need to be heading in, and there's more that we can be doing too.
Last year, there was a housing affordability task force that the provincial government in Ontario had that came forward with something like 53 or 57 recommendations. I can't remember exactly. And, less than half a dozen of them were implemented. You have probably gone through a bunch of the different ideas that different people have presented. What are the ones that you think can have the best impact? What proposals do you like?
Yeah, I'm not going to pull any of them off the top of my head, so I don't recall them exactly. But
No, but
yeah, I mean,
what's the
the
chamber?
other
What's
thing
the
too,
chamber? What's the
I
chamber
will add
purpose?
this as well. The Canadian Chamber is largely focused at the federal level, and that's where we're making our recommendations on those pieces. So while a lot of the information does filter up from the provinces and or so developers that operate in specific provinces and municipality, our recommendations are largely around the federal level. So if I can give you an example of
Please.
some of that, would that be all right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So, for example, Bill C-56 was the Affordable Housing and Groceries Act that just got passed. And there were amendments in there to the Excise Tax Act that removed the GST for new purpose-built rentals. I think everybody had kind of talked about that. So the idea was that they were going to then incentivize construction. And so we reacted to that and said, this is a good policy, and generally was welcomed by kind of everybody in the housing space. That said, we did feel that bill was a missed opportunity to kind of go further and help Canada tackle the larger issue of affordability. So we talked about this a little bit earlier in the conversation, but those projects that are currently under construction are contending with interest rate increases, and we mentioned shortage of skilled labor, lack of supply for raw materials, and then obviously that creates challenges in refinancing and attracting new capital. So the reality is the viability of projects currently under constructions is now in questions, which then impacts their ability to A, complete them, and then B, start allocating capital to create new ones. So to address that problems, we did recommend some very minor changes that would just involve extending that GST rebate to projects that were currently under construction as of the date they intended to start the program. But unfortunately, that bill was sort of rushed through the Commons and the Senate, so we didn't see the amendments we were looking for. But we have had conversations about it, and we are starting to push a little bit further on that. So that's sort of an example of what we've been doing more at the national level where we do our advocacy.
Okay,
I
so let
know
me
the
understand.
Ontario thoughts about that specific provincial program.
So let me understand for a second. So what you're saying is the GST should be not just applied to future projects, but to current projects under development.
Yeah, new projects, because they wanted to incentivize new projects started
Right.
after the date. I believe it was September 13th or 14th, 2023. We're saying again, some of these projects were started previously and they're currently under development. But again, with the cost of labor going up and the cost of materials going up and interest rates going up as well, some of these projects just aren't viable anymore. And so if they could waive the GST on those, it would be a little bit easier to move these projects forward and get them completed.
So let me ask you two questions. Why wouldn't it also be extended to condominiums? Why only purpose-built rentals? And why not single-family homes?
Hey, look, that's an issue that also could be helpful as well. I think that specifically right now they're targeting rentals. Again, when we talked about some of the people that are kind of most in housing need or probably feeling a little bit more of the pressure, that's where they want to start. I'm sure that obviously if we really kind of pull every tool out of the toolbox and really want to incentivize creating housing supply, that's somewhere we could go. We saw a program here that was, an incentive that was being created, and we thought it could go further. But yeah, there's a lot more that we can talk about from that perspective as well. So we recently raised the US 1031 exchange, and this is the benefit of having some of our members operate in the US. They've seen some of the programs that they use in the US and see how they could be useful in Canada. But it's basically a swap of one real estate investment property for another like-kind property, and then that allows capital gains to be deferred. And so this would allow funds to consistently be reinvested, and this would touch, for example, rental housing in this case, and that would help tax housing supply as well. So again, there are options from a tax perspective that you can implement that will sort of help create that supply that you need, but there are still more steps to go, and there are more things to be proposed down the road.
But what about the idea of applying the GST reduction to condos and single-family homes? Do you think it makes sense?
Yeah, absolutely, because obviously that would incent more supply. It would decrease the cost for those that are putting it forward. Again, that's something that we'd have to discuss and develop and figure out if there's any appetite for doing that already. And I think that obviously things are moving and things are being done. I don't know if the government is particularly all the way there yet, but hopefully we do get more movement on that front, because like you said, we need to
don't know
really
if the
attack this
government
housing
is all the
supply.
way there yet. I shake my head. We've got this huge housing affordability crisis, and they've got to take some action. And why to do it just for purpose-built rentals and only for new projects, which, are going to start being built. Even if they start being built now or in the future, they're going to not come to market for another 2 to 3 years. So it just doesn't make any sense. Do it for single family homes, do it for condominiums, do it for townhomes, whether they're bought or rented, and do it for everything that's coming out right now to get things moving. Anyway, we got to take a break. I'm mad about this. I apologize. We're going to take a break and come back in 2 minutes with smart guy, Pascal Shan from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting with a gentleman from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce who's responsible for transportation, infrastructure, and housing. And he's really a very bright gentleman who's written a bunch of articles and posts and things like this on this topic. And we're chatting about what's gone wrong and why we have this housing affordability crisis. You mentioned 1031 exchanges in the United States, and I don't think many people know about this, but it's a really interesting concept. So I want to spend a couple of minutes explaining. And let me try to explain it in layman's terms, and then you can tell me if I'm right or wrong. So a 1031 exchange in the United States is if somebody, typically a developer, makes a profit from one development, they have to pay a capital gain. But if they then take that money and do what's called this 1031 exchange and reinvest that money in another development project or another ownership opportunity right away or within a certain time period, they don't pay the capital gains. They defer the capital gains. So they ultimately pay the capital gain at some point in time in the future. And if they invest it in something else that makes an even bigger capital gain, they'll still have to pay, the compounding capital gain. So you're not robbing the taxpayers of any money because ultimately the capital gain is paid, but you're delaying when you pay the capital gain for the investor. But I do business in the United States, and it's amazing how many developers are desperate to find that 1031 exchange, and so therefore they work like crazy to find those other opportunities. And then they invest in those opportunities for a logical sense. It's sort of like an RSP that you're compounding at pre-tax dollars rather than at after-tax dollars. And when you think about it, it creates a huge incentive for developers, for construction companies, for owners, for regular investors that have invested in real estate to do more rather than having to lose 25% of their profit and pay it to the government. It makes a ton of sense to me. Why wouldn't we do that kind of tax modification in Canada?
Yeah, I agree, and I think that there's good ideas, and I will, say we've met with the Minister of Housing's office as well, and they've suggested that it's something that they've heard and that they're thinking about, and they've encouraged us to keep talking about it and bring more proposals forward. So hopefully, it's something that we can see in the near future. But I completely agree, and that's again the purview of our members as well. Look, as you mentioned, we're in a housing crisis, so it's time to shift into crisis management mode, and let's look at every option that's there, and whatever we can do to create that supply. And like you said, this is a huge incentive to then reinvest, additional financing into the creation of more housing. So why wouldn't you enable that at this point when we need to build as much as possible?
I agree, and I think you and your chamber should keep on that. So thank you for that. You had mentioned the second major impact, and then I interrupted you. I apologize, but let's come back to it. So it was the availability and cost of labor and construction supplies. I've heard people tell me, even if municipalities opened up and allowed a lot more development to occur, we just don't have the construction workers that could actually do it.
That's exactly right. I mean, what we're hearing is a lot of kind of boomers are at the point of retiring right now, a lot of them who are in that industry. And I think that there's the issue of how we're going to be replacing those workers. So if I'll just step back for a second and say, so Statistics Canada just put out fourth quarter results for their building construction price indexes, which show that construction costs for residential buildings in the census metropolitan area composite rose 6% year over year. So that's already significant. And again, if I'm not mistaken, I believe since 2017, I saw that construction for those 11 biggest cities in Canada was up quite a bit. So I think it was like 73% in the country, and specifically 79 in Calgary, 65% in Edmonton. So again, we're seeing that, and that's something that they're contending with recently and kind of over a period of time. So that's very, very complicated. And some of the things we've talked about. So for example, I mentioned what we'd asked of Minister Fraser on tying the infrastructure funds to the creation of more housing, but we also did ask him when he was appointed to lean on his background as Minister of Immigration to look at facilitating or prioritizing immigrants from the home building sector that would help, again, increase that labor availability, bring in the skilled labor that we need to create more of that housing supply. So again, we were pleased to see that it had moved in Minister Miller's plan that was released in the fall, but there's likely still more adjustments that we'll have to bring forward on that, and that's going to require further analysis.
So I think one of the complaints I've heard is that our immigration system and the point system that we use is too biased toward education. And we should have a similar bias toward skills like laborers, construction workers, contractors, carpenters, etc. And allowing, if not, frankly, looking for and finding and attracting people that can work in the construction industry. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something that we've called for as well. So overview, I mean, the Canadian Chamber advocates for harnessing immigration to foster that economic growth and address labor shortages. And obviously, one big piece of that is education, increasing our productivity and making sure we have the workers to increase that. But as well, we did call on, an adjustment of those priorities to focus on the home building sector. And that's very important. I think another area that we talk about a lot is health. Again, we're going to need healthcare workers to make sure the system is not overrun. So yeah, absolutely. There's definitely pockets of needs for specific areas that need to be focused on as well as part of that assessment. But yeah, we definitely do need, especially in the home building sector, a little bit more on that front. And like I said, if labor is not available, we've got to find, and that also includes, I will add this caveat as well. It's not entirely up for us to bring in skilled labor through immigration. We do have a responsibility to develop that capacity domestically too.
No question, I agree. What about construction pricing? Is there anything we can do on that?
Yeah, the availability of materials is complicated. It's a big piece. Obviously, we don't necessarily have access to all of it, but I will say this. We've overseen strikes in the ports in BC. We've seen them also in the St. Lawrence Seaway, and that specifically we talked about gypsum, cement, things that are used for construction. I think that making sure our supply chains are reliable and resilient is a big part of what we talk about at the Chamber. I think that making sure we have the tools to resolve labor disputes when they do occur so that they don't drag out. Like I said, in 4 months, we saw 3 weeks of strikes, 2 at the ports in BC. One in the St. Lawrence Seaway, to make sure that we're not holding things up and we're not preventing Canadians from getting the goods that they need and they use every day, but also that the cost of those goods and those commodities doesn't go through the roof and they're available when they're needed. That's also a part that I think that we can control a bit more domestically, and that's what we need to see.
What about the CMHC? I've heard that the review and approval time period at the CMHC has ballooned because of increased requests for CMHC financing for rental housing, which is what we would want. Is there more money that we should be dedicating to the loans and/or more money to hire smart reviewers?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to assess the quality of the reviewers, but yeah, I think that if there's a resource issue where things are taking too long, I believe there was an element or an item in the fall economic statement that talked about giving CMHC the resources they require. I'm not quite sure what the dollar amount associated was with it, but absolutely, I think there's been an acknowledgement within government that they need a process or an improvement to get approvals done faster, and hopefully they're working on that and things are progressing. And I think that also we've talked about, again, at the municipal level, that review of the approvals that needs to be a lot quicker. So again, when Minister Fraser is negotiating with these provinces and municipalities, they start talking about, is this a significant barrier compared to other regions? And if so, maybe what they need to do is dedicate a little bit more funding to that as well, to making sure that those they have the resources on hand to move these approvals along more efficiently.
What about transit? One of your other areas of responsibility is transit. Are we spending enough money building a transit system in Toronto and in Vancouver and Ottawa and Canada?
Yeah, it varies from place to place. Obviously, I live in Ottawa, where there have been some challenges around transit, and I'm not going to go into that specifically. But yeah, I think that definitely, and it aligns with the government's agenda of combating climate change and reducing emissions. I think transit has to be an important piece of that, and like we said, density around those transit heavy areas is probably what's best as we move forward on that front. So are we dedicating enough? I mean, it's going to depend region to region. I think in BC, there's a lot of enthusiasm around building those projects, and there's quite the commitment from the provincial government as well. So again, it kind of depends region to region. I haven't specifically dug into public transit specifically.
I really think it's a associated challenge and problem. I think you've got to, build the transit so that people can then build the density around the transit, and people don't need to therefore buy a car or buy as many cars, and use the transit to get to work and enjoy life. And I really think that it's a combination. And when you think about it, if we don't build the transit and the density around the transit, by definition, we got to build single family homes and highways, and people are going to live farther afield. And so we're going to spend that money, but we're going to spend it in other ways. And so I think that the only solution is improved investment in transit. And I don't think we've done it. I think the Ontario line is a great move forward, but that's the first new line in a long, long time in the Toronto area. And so I really think that those two have to go together. So we've talked about increasing supply through decreasing government red tape, municipal government red tape and regulations. We've talked about doing things to reduce the cost by decreasing or taking away the GST on purpose-built rentals and maybe expanding that. We've talked about increasing the incentive for developers to develop again by a 1031 exchange, like tax benefit coming from the United States to Canada. We've talked about increasing immigration of foreign trained skilled construction workers. What else?
Yeah, I mean, especially at the federal level, a lot of it comes down to the availability of capital. So tax structures specifically are very important. Like you said, we've talked about GST removal for new construction. The 1031 exchange as well is something else. And I think that, like you said, we've got to get to a point where there's a proper assessment of how much this is going to change and what more can be there. And also, what can we do as far as low-cost loans? You saw part of the new apartment construction fund. I apologize if I'm messing up the name, but it's the rebranding of the rental construction financing initiative. That's set to start to be delivered in 2026, also being allocated some of it for student housing. So again, I think that, again, the pieces around financing from the federal government are going to be more and more important. But I think also, and I mean, it sounds like a bit of a general and vague explanation, but I think we just need a lot more coordination between all levels of government, the municipal, the provincial, and the federal, because ultimately this is a problem that kind of hits at every stage. And unless they're all talking to each other and working together, they're sort of working against each other in a way. And we've already seen that with the attempts with the Housing Accelerator Fund. We talked about Metro Vancouver, but again, them removing the funding right after they found out that development charges were going to be increased municipally, which is working at cross purposes. So I think that that's a very important piece that we're going to need to see moving forward, and that we haven't necessarily seen entirely to this point. So it's a bit of a kind of high level answer, but I think that there's a lot of work to be done there specifically.
I think there is a lot of work to be done. And I think that, we proved during COVID-19, maybe with climate change, some other crises that we've had, that government can work together if they get their act together and really pay attention to it and see it as the crisis that it really is. And I just don't think government's doing it yet. Lots of talk, but not enough action. And I do think that there's been a couple of backtracking, maybe because of bad implementation or complete wrong implementation, like the opening up of the green belt and municipal boundaries and some of the MZOs and stuff like that. So I think that maybe the government rushed and did wrong things and lost some of their confidence because of being slapped on the wrist because of those things. And I think it was completely appropriate that they have to backtrack on those issues, but it's regrettable if that cautions them so that they don't move forward on the housing crisis the way they should.
Yeah.
We're going to take a break for some messages to come back for some concluding comments from Pascal Chan. And he said this impacted him personally. And I really want to turn and in the last couple of minutes ask Pascal, how it actually impacted him, this housing affordability crisis. Because I think when we think about it in the abstract, it's sort of difficult to understand. But I talk to my kids about this. They're driving an hour outside of Toronto to look for homes because they can't afford anything in more closer proximity to Toronto. And then even then, there's no way they can afford it. So I think it really does have a personal impact. And I think Pascal's going to share that with us. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Pascal Chan. He is head of the group that looks at transportation, infrastructure, and housing at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. He's written a couple of articles recently. He's been interviewed on some other podcasts, and he's a smart guy and has given a lot of thought to these issues. Because in addition to his research, Pascal, you told me that it's impacted you personally. Tell me how this housing affordability crisis has impacted you personally.
Yeah, I just talked about it a little bit earlier, and I think that we've seen again in the last few years, things have really kind of accelerated. But I can drastically see the difference between some of my friends who perhaps bought around the time that I did, which is about 12, 13 years ago, and then that are looking to get into the housing market now as well. Again, that we're facing very, very different realities with the average cost of a home at that point. I think that, again, I've known people that have kind of put it on multiple bids to try to secure, a home right now. I remember when I was purchasing my condo, 12, 13 years ago, where there was a negotiation that went back and forth over a period of about a month. And so it's just a very, very different reality. And I can say that, again, incomes have not necessarily moved along with that. So a lot of them are feeling the issue there specifically. And I think that, again, as you continue, you kind of observe it, or you've been within any sort of housing transaction as of late, you're really noticing it, and Canadians are feeling it as well, as they contend with a higher cost of living sort of everywhere. And then that's something we talk about, even with my work around supply chains. Again, what is the cost for Canadians, and how is this impacting them? But yeah, the housing obviously being a huge piece, getting into home ownership over the last decade or so has been something that's really kind of been front of mind for me.
I interviewed a gentleman from British Columbia who runs an organization that's sort of about intergenerational equity. And he said that the tragedy here is that we are the first generation in history that's going to leave our next generation poorer off, in worst economic situations because of the housing affordability crisis. And effectively what we've done is we've done a transfer from our children to us, and that there's a potential for intergenerational strife and protest. Do you think it's that bad?
I hope it's not that bad, but again, we'd have to look at what exactly is going to be coming up in the next little while. How is the housing market going to react to certainly global forces? How specifically our economy is going to recover? Obviously, COVID-19 was a huge event that had a huge impact on kind of all aspects of our lives as we went forward. And so now that we are looking at the next steps, we're going to have to see exactly how the chips fall around there. And hopefully things do kind of improve. And we are seeing, I think, signs that it might be a bit of a soft landing. And we're hoping that, again, frankly, we're going to get our productivity up, housing affordability restored, and we're going to move in that direction. But we don't necessarily know that that's going to be the case. And going on the way things have accelerated over the last couple of years, and seeing, again, that we're not necessarily on track to hit our housing supply targets, I don't know that that's necessarily going to be a possibility.
So, I'm reasonably pessimistic, I guess, about the ability for government to get their act together and address this problem. It sounds like you're more optimistic. Is that the case?
I'd like to say I'm just more optimistic personally, but yeah, as I mentioned, we're out here advocating for them to pull every tool out of the toolbox and let the private sector be a real partner and build the housing supply that we need. And we hope that government is going to work with us and work with their other partners at other levels of government. But again, I'm optimistic because I think that we're seeing changes at the moment. But is it going to be enough? I'm not sure. I certainly hope it will be.
Pascal Chan, thank you so much for joining us. And I encourage you to keep on fighting, because I think you're fighting the good fight for the benefit of those people most vulnerable in our society, people that don't have homes, people that want to buy homes, young people, students, people that are just, starting their life, getting married and wanting to have kids. And in today's marketplace, it's so challenging for them to afford a house. And if you're able to, with your work, you're going to make it more more readily available for them to do that. For renters that want to get out of the rental market and into the housing market, and for people that don't have a home to get into the rental market, and for newcomers to our society, to our country, that we attract to this country. We want them to come. We want to build up our population for all the reasons that we've talked about. And yet when they come here, they can't get a house because they can't afford it. So I think that you are fighting the good fight for the most vulnerable in society up against some established interests that I don't know why they have created this situation. I don't think they're the people that can solve it because they created the situation. And so I congratulate you and the Chamber for the efforts that you're doing. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me, Brian. I really appreciate it.
That's our show for tonight. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 p.m. on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Ottawa, sir, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos are available on my website, briancrombie.com. I post my podcasts on a whole bunch of different podcast servers and all my videos on social media, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Thanks. Good night, everybody. Thanks, Pascal.